one of the specialty or performance takeoffs you'll be asked to perform on your check ride is a soft field takeoff. A soft field takeoff technique would be used anytime you're going to take off on other than a hard surface runway. So for example, if you were going to take off on grass or gravel, you would prefer to use the soft field takeoff. Now, the soft field takeoff method, you should always refer to the pilot operating handbook or the owner's manual because it will specify the configuration to use. For example, does the aircraft require 10 degrees of flaps, 25 degrees of flaps, or no flaps? How could you get the best performance out of your aircraft? So in this aircraft, POH for example, it says that your wing flap settings, it's best to use 10 degrees of flaps if you're going to perform a soft field takeoff, because those 10 degrees of flaps will help the aircraft become airborne sooner. Now, if you think about trying to push an aircraft, let's say you're going to hand push an aircraft across a concrete surface or a grass surface, which is going to be more difficult? Sure, to push it across the grass surface. So when we're trying to take off, as long as that aircraft is in the grass, it produces a lot of drag and it's difficult for the aircraft to accelerate. So the idea behind a soft field takeoff is to force the aircraft off the ground early and ride in ground effect at a low airspeed, allow the aircraft to accelerate in ground effect until a safe speed, and then we can depart the runway environment area. So be sure you refer to the POH to see what configuration best suits your aircraft. Now also, when you're thinking about the amount of runway necessary for takeoff and you reference the performance section in the POH, almost always there's going to be a notation that gives you information about if you're going to use a soft or grass strip runway. So on this one it says that you have to increase your takeoff distance 15%, where you would use 15% more runway in order to perform a soft field takeoff. So just keep that in mind, always refer to your POH, I can't stress that enough. Now if the POH is a little bit vague in the performance, in the way that you should perform the soft field takeoff, you can always refer to the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook. That'll give you some additional good insight on performing a soft field takeoff. So on the board here I wrote the steps that we would use for a soft field takeoff, and at first it says aft yoke pressure while taxiing. So when we're taxiing, it's very important that you keep the elevator control or the aft, the yoke, all the way back. What that does is it keeps the weight off that nose wheel, just in case you inadvertently hit a soft spot in the ground or perhaps even a little hole. You wouldn't want the weight of the aircraft going forward on the nose wheel and possibly creating a prop strike. So be sure that when you're taxiing even, you keep that full elevator back pressure. And again, I wrote up here, check your POH for your flap settings as recommended, and you want to have the plane configured properly before you take the runway. Now, when you're taking position on the runway, this says continue to roll while entering the runway. We don't really want to stop if possible. We'd like to kind of round the corner and continue your smooth rollout onto the runway. So a bit of pre-planning, you may have to round the corner a little bit and to try not to use brakes. But obviously if the aircraft is going to go off the one side of the runway or the other, certainly apply a little bit of toe pressure brake with it. But a little pre-planning, you should be able to kind of round the corner and take position on the center line of the runway and continue with your takeoff. The next thing we have is perform a rolling takeoff. Again, stressing you should not have to stop. So as you position the airplane onto the center line, it says position the ailerons appropriate for the wind conditions. So don't forget the winds because they don't forget you. So if we have a right crosswind, it's still necessary to apply the ailerons into the wind, or left and vice versa. It says smoothly apply full throttle and check your engine gauges. So just because we're doing a specialty takeoff, don't ignore the basics. The basics are compensating for the wind, and as you advance the throttle full forward, that you always check your engine gauges and that your airspeed is beginning to increase. So once we apply full throttle and we're on a rolling takeoff, we should be careful, and it says adjust your aft yoke pressure to keep from causing a tail strike. Now remember, we were taxiing with the elevator all the way back, and as you advance full throttle, it's possible that it creates a pitch up or a nose pitch up attitude causing your tail to strike, and we wouldn't want that. So be very careful. It of course depends on your aircraft, and it of course depends on the amount of horsepower produced, But as you advance full throttle, usually you have to release a little bit of that back pressure you were using while taxiing to prevent the tail strike. But you still have a significant amount of back pressure on the yoke. The next thing it says is that as the aircraft begins to leave the runway, that the aft yoke pressure must begin to be released. So once we begin to take off, the airplane, you feel it lifting up off of the ground, and you have a very nose-high pitch attitude, it's possible you can't see over the dash, and that's okay. Often you have to use your peripheral to make sure that the airplane stays on the center line, as well as when the airplane begins to leave the runway. So as the airplane begins to leave the runway, you have to release the back pressure because you are actually forcing it off the runway early. So you release some of that back pressure and you allow the airplane to go more to a level pitch attitude. And then it says fly in ground effect until VX. Well, remember that ground effect. Ground effect is when we fly very close to the runway, and they say about a half a wingspan width from the runway. So if this is my runway, I need to be pretty close to that runway in order for ground effect to work for us. So remember, ground effect, it allows the airplane to fly at a lower airspeed than normal because the airflow patterns around the airplane are disrupted, and which disrupts some of our drag, and that allows the airplane to fly at a slower airspeed. So we reduce our induced drag, allowing the airplane to fly at a slower airspeed, and we can take advantage of that and allow the airplane to accelerate out of the grass, but we want it to accelerate to at least VX. Your VX speed is a speed that we normally use as our best angle of climb to clear a 50-foot obstacle. But when we're performing a soft field takeoff, even if there was not an obstacle, it's a speed that there is enough wind now going over our control surfaces that the airplane can fly, and can fly out of ground effect. So we want to accelerate to our VX speed, and then after leaving ground effect, we can continue to accelerate through our VY speed and retract the flaps as specified in the POH. So if you did have flaps in, most of the time as you're accelerating through VY, you are allowed to retract those flaps. Now be careful when you retract those flaps. Remember, the airplane may settle a little bit, so if there are any obstacles, be sure that you're well clear of the obstacles, just in case the airplane settles a little bit as you retract those flaps. Now, lastly, it just says continue with a normal cruise climb. So let's look at an aerial view. We'll draw a runway here, and this is the taxiway. So let's say you were back here at the hold short line. Remember, 2 solid, 2 dashed. So perhaps you performed your engine run up here, and now you're ready to take position and take off on the runway. So what we want to do as we taxi out is kind of round the corner to prevent having to use those brakes. So try to round the corner a little bit and go ahead and accelerate, and off you go following all of these steps. So what does our profile view look like? Well, we'll draw a little runway here. And when you first taxi down to the runway, remember you have a great deal of aft elevator pressure. And as you begin to accelerate, then you're going to have to reduce that pitch attitude just a little bit in order to not create a tail strike. And then as we advance down the runway and our airspeed increases, we would end up with more of a level pitch attitude, flying very, very close to the ground, but a couple feet off the ground, flying with a level pitch attitude, allowing the airplane to accelerate until our VX. Once you arrived at your VX speed, then you can safely leave the runway and accelerate through your VY speed. And the VY speed, we said, is when you can retract your flaps safely. Again, be careful if there's any obstacles here. Don't retract those flaps too soon and cause the aircraft to settle back into any obstacles. But once we have cleaned the aircraft up, then we can just resume with a normal cruise climb, and off we go on our new big adventure. So the main steps to a soft field takeoff would be sure that you taxi with full back pressure on the elevator and round the corner on your takeoff to get your position on the runway. And then as you advance full throttle, release a little bit of that back pressure to avoid a tail strike. Be sure you still check your engine gauges and your airspeed. Be sure that you still compensate for the winds. Allow the airplane to accelerate, and as you feel the airplane lift off the ground, you have to lower the nose until you're in a level pitch attitude just a couple feet off the runway. Allow the aircraft to accelerate to VX, then we can safely leave the runway, accelerate through VY, retract flaps or put gear up depending on what airplane you're flying, and then we would just accelerate into a normal cruise climb. So it takes a little bit of practice, and most students are a bit timid in this phase right here where you have to push the airplane's nose back to level position. They feel like they're very, very close to the runway, which we should be very, very close to the runway. And every now and then, as you start to push the nose back down, perhaps you allow the nose to go to level a little too soon, and the airplane may touch back down on the grass. Well, if it's the main gear that touches, that's okay, because the main gear can take that. Just be sure not to ever let the nose wheel touch back down into that grass. But anyway, that's how you would perform a soft field takeoff.